Many kids with autism need to be taught to answer yes and no, and very few professionals know how to teach this skill. So today, it's all about yes and no. Hi, I'm Dr. Mary Barbera, autism mom, board-certified behavior analyst, and best-selling author. When my son Lucas was 2 years old, before he was diagnosed with autism, he went to weekly speech therapy. And at the time, I knew nothing about how to try to help him speak more. He always had a few words, but I never really knew how to get more out of him. So we'd go to speech therapy, and I was observing each time, and I would go in there, and the speech therapist would start out with things like bubbles and having him request more bubbles and say bubbles. And so everything was fine during that part of speech therapy. In fact, she was doing a little pairing, which I didn't know what that was. But then he was 2, and she would get out a stack of cards, and half of them would be apples and half of them would be other things like a bed and a ball and whatever. And she would go through the cards and she'd say, "Is this an apple?" And she'd want him to say yes or no. He had no idea. He was making constant errors. I didn't know that what she was actually doing was yes-no tax, which he was 2. And I think he acquired yes-no tax when he was 12. So she was working on things that were way too hard. And I didn't know, anything about it. So the ability to say yes and no, to respond yes and no to any question is a very complex skill involving different operants. So when I say an operant, I mean a mand, a tact, an interverbal. Those are verbal operants. They were coined by B.F. Skinner in his classic book in 1957 called Verbal Behavior. So when we look at the skill of yes-no, we need to look at it in terms of the operants. It's been my experience that a child needs to master yes-no mands, answering yes and no to a question such as, do you want a cookie? With the cookie in sight, they need to learn to mand yes-no appropriately before you should attempt to introduce yes-no tax, such as, is this an apple or is this a bed, which the speech therapist was doing when Lucas was 2. And you should really need to wait to even think about teaching yes-no interverbals, which interverbals are no pictures present. So those are questions such as, does a cow say quack? Or does a boy wear a dress? And so we have yes-no mands for items a child may want, like a cookie. We have yes-no tax for, is this a pen? Is this a bed? That's a lot more difficult than yes-no mands. And then yes-no interverbals are even trickier because that's a higher skill. So assessing yes and no within each operant is a great place to start. And I've done a lot of work with teaching yes and no mands to Lucas as well as several other children. Teaching a child to say no or to respond with a head shake no can be taught early to replace problem behavior such as crying or pushing away items the child doesn't want. But teaching a child to say yes should not be done until important prerequisites are in place. I recommend not teaching yes mands until the child is spontaneously manding or requesting dozens of items both in sight and out of sight. And also the child should be manding for several actions, such as come or push or those sorts of actions. I've seen many children who have defective yes mands because someone taught them too early to answer yes. So it's very common even for adults with severe autism to answer yes when you ask them any question that they don't know what the answer is. So I had a client once who was in his early 20s and someone at his day program said, "Have you ever been on a boat?" And he said yes. And I looked at her, I said, do you know if he ever has been on a boat? She's like, I have no idea. And this young man would say yes to pretty much anything. The main issue is that when children or adults say yes, when someone offers them something, do you want candy or do you want a tickle, they cannot ask for, if they can't ask for those items and they're just saying yes, they don't never man for the actual item spontaneously by using the item name such as candy or tickle. That yes can become a generalized man, similar to the way manding for more gets you into trouble, because the child may be saying more, having problem behaviors, or they may be saying yes and having problem behaviors, or you don't know what they mean. So they're saying yes and you're like looking at them like, what do you want? And they're not spontaneously manding with the item name. That's the main problem with teaching yes too early. It really affects spontaneous manding, which is so important to a child's development. Now, yes-no tacting, answering, is this an apple, or is this a pen, or even is this blue, or am I standing, is a much harder skill than yes-no mans and should not be introduced until a child can indicate yes or no and man for items out of sight. For yes-no intraverbals, it's important that the instructor know the answer to the question they're asking. For example, that scenario I gave you where, have you ever been on a boat? If you don't know the answer to the question, it's not a good question for a child who's weak with yes, no, without any visuals. So there are many children and adults with autism who over answer yes because they don't understand complex language. It's not their fault. For this reason, I usually don't focus on teaching any intraverbal yes-no responses. But a lot of times I do have to directly teach yes-no mans and yes-no tacts and let the intraverbal yes-no without any visuals develop more gradually and only teach basic, functional, and important yes-no intraverbals. So I know this was kind of complex, and usually my vlogs are a little bit more basic, but it is really important when you think about yes-no to think about, is it a yes-no mand with the item in sight, such as, do you want this cookie? Or is it a yes-no mand for an item out of sight, like, do you want ketchup on your hamburger? Yes-no tacts are much harder than yes-no mans, and that's, is this a car, is this a bed, is this an apple? And yes-no intraverbals should be really put on the back burner, and that's asking a child questions that you don't know the answer to. The questions are probably way too complex, and it's just not going to be functional to teach those complex skills, at least if you're working with an intermediate learner. I go over all these techniques and many more like this in my online courses. And to get started learning more about my approach, you can sign up for my new 3-step guide in the description right below, or join me on my mission at marybarbera.com/join. And I'll see you next week.